oh, 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 oh.
The topic of cannibalism in primitive societies has always attracted widespread interest and controversy. For a long time, this practice was considered exclusively ritualistic, associated with beliefs and ceremonies. However, archaeological discoveries in recent decades have revealed new and sometimes shocking facts. Traces of cutting have been found on the bones of ancient people, comparable to those left when processing animal carcasses. This forces us to reconsider our usual ideas about primitive society. Perhaps cannibalism was not so much a ritual as an extreme measure of survival during the Ice Age, when every source of food was worth its weight in gold. Let's take a look at what exactly happened to our ancestors during that harsh era. Today, we will look into the darkest pages of human history and learn how our ancestors fought for their lives when they had no other choice. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how desperate people ate each other for survival and how this differed from ritual cannibalism. In Gough's cave, located in modern-day England, archaeologists made one of the most stunning discoveries. Among the many bones belonging to ancient humans, skulls were found that had been processed in such a way that they could be used as bowls or vessels. These artifacts, dating back approximately 700 years, leave no doubt that cannibalism took place. However, this was not simply a matter of cutting up food. Traces were found on the bones indicating careful processing, removal of flesh, neat dismemberment, and even splitting of bones to extract bone marrow. This suggests that cannibalism in this case was not an act of desperation, but rather part of a ritual. Archaeological evidence of ritual cannibalism has also been found in other parts of the world. In caves in France and Spain, Neanderthal bones have been found with cuts similar to those left when processing the carcasses of large animals, such as deer or mammoths. However, in some cases, the remains were placed in specific positions and the bones were arranged in special patterns, indicating the symbolic significance of these actions. Eating the flesh of the deceased may have been a way to preserve their spirit within the tribe. It could also have been part of a funeral rite, where the living tried to establish a connection with their ancestors in order to gain their wisdom or strength. Thus, cannibalism was not only a means of survival, but also an important element of the spiritual life of primitive man. Some cultures had strict rules about who could be eaten and who could not. For example, eating the flesh of members of one's own tribe might have been forbidden, while the flesh of enemies, on the contrary, was considered permissible. Cannibalism has left a deep mark on mythology and literature. Many cultures have myths about cannibals who eat people. These stories are often used to scare and warn people against violating social norms. They also serve as a reminder of what can happen if a person loses their humanity and becomes a beast. Such myths usually carry a deep moral message and teach people to respect one another. This shows that cannibalism, even in mythology, was associated not only with the physical act, but also with deeper social and moral aspects. Understanding this helps us better understand how human societies developed and how they overcame their darkest moments. But what if everything we know about cannibalism was completely different from what we imagine? What if it's not just food, but something much more complex? Write in the comments how you think people in modern society might be motivated to return to cannibalism. One of the most famous finds was the Neanderthal bones in the Sima de los Huesos cave in Spain. Here, traces of stone tools were found on the bones, which coincided with the traces of animal carcasses being cut up. This indicates that Neanderthals used the same tools and techniques to cut up their fellow humans as they did to cut up their prey. This may have been an act of survival in conditions of famine. During the Ice Age, when resources were extremely limited, survival was extremely difficult. Perhaps cannibalism was an extreme measure to avoid starvation. These findings challenge our ideas about the morals and ethics of primitive man. Further research in the Cima de los Huesos cave and other similar sites has provided even more information. Archaeologists have carefully studied the nature of the marks on the bones. For example, some remains were found to have long, thin cuts made with sharp stone blades. These marks indicated that the flesh had been separated from the bones with great care, as if to make the most of every piece. Other bones showed marks made by heavy stones, indicating that they had been split open to extract bone marrow, a nutritious and calorie-rich food that was so important for survival in harsh conditions. If cannibalism was a forced act, it can be assumed that people tried to use every opportunity to gain at least some benefit. Studying these details, archaeologists conclude that cannibalism was not just random eating, but a deliberate survival strategy, albeit an extremely desperate one. It is important to note that in most cases, where cannibalism is associated with starvation, the marks on the bones have their own characteristics. They are usually less neat than in the case of ritual cannibalism. People struggling with starvation do not spend time carefully processing the remains. They are focused on getting as many calories as possible in a short period of time. That is why the marks on the bones in the Sima de los Huesos cave and other sites where cannibalism was an act of desperation differ from those found in the Gough cave, where cannibalism was ritualistic. However, we should not assume that cannibalism was a widespread phenomenon. Cannibalism was the exception, not the rule. But even these rare cases leave a deep mark on history and make us think about how far we have come since then. What do you think distinguished cannibalism for survival from ritual cannibalism? We'll tell you in a minute. Ritual cannibalism, unlike cannibalism caused by hunger, had completely different goals. In some cultures, eating the flesh of one's fellow tribesmen was considered a way to absorb their strength, wisdom, or bravery. For example, some tribes had a custom of eating the heart of an enemy to gain their valor. In other cases, cannibalism could be part of funeral rites. Members of the tribe could eat the flesh of the deceased so that their spirit would remain in the tribe. It was not just food, but a complex ritual aimed at preserving the memory of ancestors and maintaining a connection between generations. This practice was not related to hunger, but was deeply symbolic in nature. Ritual cannibalism could also be linked to social status. In some tribes, only chiefs or warriors had the right to participate in such rituals. This made cannibalism a kind of privilege available only to a few. In this case, eating flesh was a symbol of power and strength. It could be part of an initiation or ritual that allowed a person to move to a new level in the social hierarchy. Thus, ritual cannibalism was not only a spiritual practice, but also a tool for maintaining hierarchy in primitive society. Another form of ritual cannibalism was endocannibalism, that is, eating the flesh of members of one's own tribe. In this case, cannibalism was associated with funeral rites. For example, after a person's death, their body could be eaten by close relatives so that their spirit would remain in the tribe and not pass on to the other world. In contrast to endocannibalism, there was exocannibalism, which involved eating the flesh of enemies. This practice was intended to absorb the strength and bravery of the enemy. In the end, ritual cannibalism was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that had many causes and manifestations. It was linked to beliefs, social status, and funeral rites. How do archaeologists distinguish cannibalism caused by hunger from ritual cannibalism? The answer lies in the traces left on the bones. If cannibalism was an act of survival, the bones usually bear traces indicating quick and careless cutting. The bones may be simply broken and the flesh roughly cut off. The differences in the marks on the bones can be compared to how modern chefs cut meat. If you are in a hurry and hungry, you will simply cut off a large piece to eat quickly. If you are preparing an exquisite dish, you will carefully separate the meat from the bones, use different tools, and spend a lot of time doing so. Archaeologists also pay attention to which parts of the body were used. If cannibalism was an act of survival, then people most likely ate all edible parts of the body, including the brain, internal organs, and bone marrow. If cannibalism was ritualistic, then only certain parts of the body that had symbolic meaning could have been used. For example, the heart or brain. In some cases, skulls were used to make vessels or bowls. This indicates that these body parts had special significance. By studying these traces, we can better understand how our ancestors developed and how they were able to overcome their darkest moments. But what if, instead of rituals, they were simply preparing a delicious meal for themselves? How could cannibalism have become a delicacy during the Ice Age? Let's uncover the truth about these horrifying facts in a minute. The Ice Age was one of the most severe trials for humanity. Low temperatures, limited food sources, and the constant threat of predators forced our ancestors to fight for survival. In such conditions, cannibalism could have been the only way to avoid starvation. Hunting large game such as mammoths or cave bears was an extremely dangerous and unpredictable activity. Failure could lead to starvation. In such conditions, when supplies were exhausted and hunting was unsuccessful, cannibalism became a last resort. This may seem horrific from our perspective, but for primitive people, it was the only way to survive and preserve the tribe. It was not an act of cruelty, but rather an act of self-sacrifice, where one person gave their life to save others. Thus, cannibalism during the Ice Age was not simply an act of desperation, but a phenomenon as complex and multifaceted as cannibalism in other periods of human history. Scientists suggest that cannibalism may have been one of the reasons for the extinction of the Neanderthals. Despite their strength and endurance, they were unable to compete with the Cro-Magnons, but new data shows that it was much more complicated than that. Neanderthals were incredibly adaptable, surviving the harsh conditions of the Ice Age for hundreds of thousands of years. However, when Cro-Magnons arrived in their territory, the situation changed. Resources became more limited, and competition became fiercer. Under these conditions, cannibalism may have become not just an act of desperation, but part of their everyday life. Perhaps Neanderthals practiced cannibalism in response to food shortages, which in turn may have had negative consequences for their health and social structure. Cannibalism may also have weakened their social bonds. Unlike Cro-Magnons, who lived in large, cohesive groups, Neanderthals lived in small tribes. The loss of even one person was a great tragedy for them. If cannibalism became part of their culture, it could have led to mistrust and aggression within the tribe, which could ultimately have led to its collapse. Thus, cannibalism may have been one of the reasons for the extinction of the Neanderthals, but not the only one. It was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that had both practical and symbolic significance. It was linked to survival, rituals, and social structure. And yet, how did the evolution of consciousness influence the food culture of Neanderthals? Let's discuss it right now. With the development of humanity, cannibalism gradually became a thing of the past. With the advent of agriculture and animal husbandry, people ceased to depend on hunting and gathering. This led to the emergence of stable food sources and, as a result, to a decrease in cases of cannibalism caused by hunger. Ritual cannibalism was also gradually replaced by new beliefs and customs. With the advent of writing and more complex social structures, humanity began to realize the value of human life. Cannibalism came to be considered taboo, something unacceptable. The Neolithic Revolution, or the transition to a sedentary lifestyle, was one of the key moments in human history. The resulting stability allowed people to focus on other aspects of life, such as the development of social structures, art, and most importantly, moral norms. With the growth of settlements and the formation of more complex communities, humanity began to develop new ideas about life and death. Gradually, more complex funeral rituals emerged, replacing cannibalism as a way of honoring the memory of the deceased. Instead of eating the flesh of the deceased, people began to bury them in specially designated places, creating monuments or performing special rituals. These rituals reflected a new understanding of human life and its value. People began to be seen not simply as a source of food or resources, but as individuals who deserved to be treated with respect. With the advent of writing and more developed mythology, cannibalism came to be seen as something terrible. Myths and legends of many peoples featured stories of cannibals, who were portrayed as monsters or evil spirits. These stories served as a kind of moral compass that helped people distinguish good from evil. They taught that cannibalism was not just food, but something that turned a person into a beast. The taboo on cannibalism became part of a moral code that was passed down from generation to generation and helped maintain order in society. The evolution of consciousness led humanity to become aware of its uniqueness. People began to ask questions about their place in the world, the meaning of life, and what happens after death. These reflections led to the emergence of philosophy and religion. Within these new belief systems, cannibalism came to be considered a sin or a crime against the divine order. It was not just an act of violence, but a violation of the sacred laws that governed the world. With the development of trade and contact between different peoples, cannibalism came to be seen as a sign of backwardness or savagery. Civilized societies condemned the practice and sought to eradicate it. Cannibalism became a symbol of savagery and uncivilization, which further reinforced the taboo against it. This process continued for millennia until cannibalism became a rare and exceptional phenomenon, occurring only in the most extreme situations. Thus, the evolution of consciousness and the development of humanity as a whole led to cannibalism, which was once part of the lives of our ancestors, becoming considered unacceptable and repulsive. Although cannibalism is a thing of the past, it has left its mark on mythology and literature. The legends of many peoples contain stories about cannibals who ate people. These can be mythical monsters or ordinary people who were forced to resort to desperate measures by hunger. Tales and legends about cannibals were part of oral folk art, passed down from generation to generation. Their main purpose was not to describe real events, but to reinforce the taboo on this practice in people's minds. Through images of mythical creatures such as ogres, witches, or cannibals, the authors of these stories created images of absolute evil. These characters usually lived far from human settlements, in dark forests or mountains, symbolizing their alienation from human society and morality. In mythology, cannibalism was often associated with punishment. For example, in Greek mythology, Tantalus was punished for feeding the gods the flesh of his son. This was considered the ultimate crime, and as punishment, Tantalus was condemned to eternal torment of hunger and thirst. This story served as a powerful warning that cannibalism is not just about food, but a violation of sacred laws. It showed that even the gods cannot forgive such an act, and that severe punishment awaits those who commit it. Not only mythical creatures, but also ordinary people in legends and fairy tales became cannibals. This happened in situations where they lost everything: their home, their family, and most importantly, their humanity. An example of this is the story of Hansel and Gretel, where cannibalism was associated with an evil witch. Among other things, this story served as a practical warning to children not to stray far from home and not to trust strangers. In the end, myths and legends about cannibalism weren't just entertaining stories. They were an important part of culture that helped people understand what was good and evil, what was human, and what was savage. They were a kind of moral code that was passed down from generation to generation and helped keep order in society. Modern technology allows scientists to conduct more accurate research. DNA analysis, isotope analysis, and other methods allow us to find out what ancient people ate and whether there were cannibals among them. These studies give us a more complete picture of the lives of our ancestors and the difficulties they faced. They help us understand why cannibalism was part of their lives and how they were able to overcome it. This research also helps us understand how humans were able to evolve and survive in the harshest conditions. Isotope analysis is one of the most powerful tools available to modern archaeologists. It allows them to study the chemical composition of ancient human bones, or more precisely, the carbon and nitrogen isotopes they contain. Different types of food, plants, fish, meat, have different isotopic compositions which accumulate in the bones. By studying the ratio of these isotopes, scientists can determine the diet of ancient humans with a high degree of accuracy. If human flesh was present in the diet, this will be reflected in the isotopic composition of the bones, as the human body has its own unique isotopic fingerprint. It's like a kind of DNA fingerprinting, but for food. DNA analysis has also opened up new horizons in the study of cannibalism. Researchers can extract DNA from ancient bones and compare it with the DNA of other people found in the same place. If the DNA of the victim and the alleged cannibal match, it may indicate that the cannibalism was an act of endocannibalism. That is, the eating of the flesh of members of one's own tribe. If the DNA does not match, this may indicate exocannibalism, the eating of the flesh of enemies. It's like a kind of forensic examination, only on a scale of millennia. In addition, modern methods allow us to study microscopic traces on bones. With the help of powerful microscopes, scientists can see even the smallest scratches left by stone tools. These traces can tell us how the carcass was processed. Was it cut up for food, or was it a ritual? For example, if traces indicating careful processing were found on the bones, this could indicate ritual cannibalism. If the traces were random, this could indicate cannibalism for survival. Modern research also allows us to understand how cannibalism affected the health of ancient people. For example, eating human brains could lead to the spread of various diseases, such as prion diseases. In a primitive society where there was no medicine, such diseases could be fatal. This shows that cannibalism, even if it was an act of survival, had its price. It was not just a physical act, but a complex social phenomenon that was deeply rooted in the culture and beliefs of primitive people. This research helps us better understand how human societies developed and how they overcame their darkest moments. It shows that cannibalism was not simply an act of desperation, but a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It was a kind of language that allowed primitive people to communicate with the spirits of their ancestors and understand the world around them. It was a way to preserve the memory of those they loved and pass on their wisdom and strength to their descendants. It was more than just food, it was part of their lives. Thus, modern research gives us a more complete picture of cannibalism. It helps us understand why cannibalism was part of our ancestors' lives and how they were able to overcome it. They show that cannibalism was not simply an act of desperation, but a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that had both practical and symbolic significance. It was a complex phenomenon that played an important role in the lives of our ancestors. Understanding this helps us to better understand how human societies developed and how they overcame their darkest moments. Cannibalism in primitive society is not just a story of survival. It is a story about a person who was willing to do anything to survive. It is a story about how our ancestors fought for their lives in conditions that are difficult for us to even imagine. It reminds us that humans are not just intelligent beings, but also beings capable of the most desperate acts. It is a story of how humans were able to overcome their instincts and become who they are today. From a philosophical point of view, cannibalism is a kind of extreme limit of human morality. It shows that in conditions of absolute hunger and despair, the boundaries of what is permissible are blurred. A person forced to resort to cannibalism ceases to be merely a rational being and becomes part of nature, where only the strongest survive. This brings us back to our animal instincts, to our primal fear of death. However, cannibalism is also a reminder that humanity was not created perfect. We have not always been rational and moral beings. We have come a long and difficult way to become who we are today. Cannibalism was part of that journey, part of our history. It was cruel and horrific, but it was also a lesson that helped us understand what is good and what is evil. Cannibalism can also be seen as a mirror that reflects our own vulnerability. We live in a world where food is available, where we are protected from predators and natural disasters. But what if tomorrow everything changes? What if we find ourselves in a situation where we have to fight for survival? Will we be able to preserve our humanity? Cannibalism is a reminder that our civilization is fragile and that we can revert to our animal instincts. On the other hand, cannibalism can also be seen as a symbol of human strength. The fact that we have been able to overcome this terrible instinct speaks to our ability to exercise self-control and develop moral standards. We have been able to create a society where cannibalism is considered taboo, where human life has value. This shows that we can overcome our instincts and become better. In the end, cannibalism in primitive society isn't just a story about survival. It's a story about a person who was willing to do anything to survive. It's a story about how our ancestors fought for their lives in conditions that are hard for us to even imagine. It reminds us that humans are not just intelligent beings, but also beings capable of the most desperate acts. It is a story about how humans were able to overcome their instincts and become who they are today. So, cannibalism in the Ice Age was not just an act of cruelty, but a complex phenomenon that had many causes. It could have been an act of survival in conditions of famine, a ritual aimed at preserving the memory of ancestors, or a way to absorb their strength. We will never know the whole truth, but archaeological finds and modern research give us a glimpse into the darkest pages of human history. Philosophical reflection on this topic reminds us that humans are not just rational beings, but also creatures capable of the most desperate acts. Cannibalism was a part of our history, cruel and terrible, but at the same time, it was a lesson that helped us understand what good and evil are, and how important it is not to cross certain boundaries. This is a story about how humans were able to overcome their instincts and become who they are today. This topic raises many controversies and questions. What do you think about this topic? Write in the comments what you think was the cause of cannibalism in primitive society. Was it hunger or ritual? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes about the most interesting and mysterious pages of history.